The Other Man on the Island. My name is Joseph Cotton, and some would consider me a picaroon or a marauder of the seas. It was in the year 1779 when my crew marooned me. Members of my band had accused me of stealing and plotting, and so cast me here on this island devoid of people. The penalty of abandonment on an island without food or water was considered a slow and agonising death, so much so that on rare occasions, if the accused was lucky enough, a small pistol would be granted so the castaway could blow his brains out before going completely balmy. Some of the men on my ship had argued strongly in my defence, and it was finally deemed that I should be left on an island that was considered big enough to sustain life. I was also allowed more favour than most would have been in my position, through flattering allowances such as a knife, an axe, flint and steel, 2 sacks of rice, a metal pot and a cask filled with fresh water. The mates on my side had also secreted me a spade, a compass, hooks and line, 2 books and plenty of clothing. These bestowals could keep a man alive and possibly sane on an island of this size for some time. Once cast on an island, there was always a slim possibility that the abandoned member could be caught sight of and picked up by a passing ship. This, obviously, was always considered laden with danger, as it would greatly depend on what type of crew was on board the ship. Some scallywag pirates would happily slaughter you for a gold tooth. Also, the discarded seafarer would have to be extremely careful of any passing vessels that may have connections with the Royal Navy, who would torture and hang a man on the spot just for good measure. Many moons had waxed and waned, and constant lonely sunsets had drifted beyond my count. Night became day, and day became night, and so on. I would sometimes peer out, wide-eyed across the ocean, in the hope of seeing a passing ship. Only on one occasion did I experience a sighting. I couldn't determine what type of ship it was. It was too distant, and those on board could hardly have seen the island, let alone me. This didn't stop me flailing my arms and jumping up and down like a lunatic. The early agonies of being forsaken and isolated had very gradually ebbed, and I had begun to harden to solitary life. I had gotten to know every quarter of the island and had become an excellent catcher of fish with both hook and harpoon that I fashioned from a stick. Now and again I thought I'd seen rabbits, but these proved to be very elusive. I had eaten crab, which, when cooked, was very tasty, although fish and rice had become my staple diet. On one occasion I managed to stun a seabird by throwing a rock at it, and then quickly smashing its head open with a large rock. It had obviously been good fortune, as previous and subsequent attempts had failed miserably. Nonetheless, it was a fairly tasty banquet that day. The island, I assumed, was in some kind of channel or current, as driftwood frequently washed up on the beaches. So I always had plenty of wood for fire. My rice rations were still satisfactory, although this was mainly due to prudence, which had become part of my everyday life. Water, of course, was precious, particularly as the rainfall here was sporadic. I had fashioned from a tree bark a makeshift gutter where I could direct water straight from a water gully into my wooden cask. Long dry spells would sometimes ensue, and my water rations, on occasions, had run worryingly low, so I was mindful and wasted very little. I had even dug a pit to keep the cask of water cool and fresh as possible. I kept myself occupied on the island. I would chop wood, dig pits, and sometimes have very long swims. I'm sure I'd become fitter than I ever was before. Also, this exercise induced sleep. I had never been a loner, and the weight of solitude had bore down on me so much that I had developed a habit of sleeping as often as I could. And it was when I was in slumber that I would often have precious dreams that held visions of people I knew and those I loved. Through the course of time, I'd begun to accept the fact that I may never lay eyes on another soul ever again. So, when I saw the body washed up on my island, I became very emotional. I was fearful and somewhat alarmed, for this was my island and this man could be a threat. I had kept myself well out of sight behind the rocks and just observed, waiting for him to revive. I watched in wonderment as this rickety raft with its human cargo softly undulated with the tide. I figured him for dead, as there was no sign of movement, although I was sure I heard a groan at one stage. It must have been a good hour or so before I decided to come out from where I hid, and with extreme caution and knife in hand, I made my way down to the shoreline where the body lay. As I got nearer, I could easily distinguish from the man's uniform that he was, as I suspected, a Royal Naval officer. I intensely disliked his sort. They reminded me of brutal displays of injustice and violence. His type was the main reason for the lifestyle I had embarked upon. A wayward life as a sea rover, a plunderer of the ocean. A pirate, I suppose. When I was just yards away from this nemesis of mine, I could clearly see he was still alive. He looked beaten and drawn, with abrasions and bruising about his face and hands, and there was a mood of death about him. I stared at him for a while, with the incredulity of an infant that had just seen a caterpillar for the first time. It could have been as long as 2 years since I'd seen another human being, so this was truly an exceptional day for me. With a tentative foot, I prodded his midriff. Nothing. Again I nudged him with my foot, harder this time, and still he did not budge. I pulled him off his raft and laid him down on the wet sand, and as I did, he groaned and appeared to become sentient. So I scurried back to my hiding place behind the rocks, where I carried on spying on my visitor through narrowed eyes. I watched in fascination, waiting to see what, if anything, he might do. I was almost enjoying myself, for this was an exceptional day for me. I gazed on as he came to his senses. He was a picture of bewilderment, scratching his head and gawking around, wondering where on earth he might be. At one stage, it looked as if he was trying to call out, but had grabbed his throat in clear discomfort. I guessed he was as dry as a bone. As I gulped at this pathetic figure, this helpless man who needed help, I remained stoic and kept my resolve, for it would be easy for me to become empathetic. There was a moment when I considered running down and putting him out of his misery with my knife, but I waited and viewed on, almost it seemed with an air of superiority. After a while, he began to crawl up the beach towards the rocks, passing very closely to where I hid. My heart was racing, and I felt childlike, as if playing a game of hide and seek. He managed to reach the shade of the shrubbery, where he swooned and passed out. I thought that he may even lay there dead. I had hoped that wasn't the case, as I was taking an absurd and callous pleasure in all that was occurring. After another patient spell of waiting, I once again came from my cover. There had been no movement from him for a while, but I knew he still lived when I heard whimpering. Like a predator closing in on a kill, I approached stealthily until I was standing over his comatose body. He had the appearance of a man at death's door. I kicked him softly. If he came round now, my affirmation was to make myself known. "Hey, mister!" I growled, whilst towing him softly in the ribs. There was no movement, and what suddenly struck me was how strange it felt to be vocalising to someone after all this time. "Hey, you! Wake up!" I said more brusquely, with a harder toe to his ribs. All I got in return was incoherent rambling. He seemed to be in oblivion. There was no mistaking, he was definitely in a bad way. I knelt down and patted his cheeks, but again all I got was prattle. I decided I would attempt to save this wretched man's life. So after I dragged his raft up from the surf, I heaved him over my shoulder and took him up into the forestry. He was tall and lean and not very heavy, and I managed to lug him up to the nearest water gully, where I laid him down. He remained unconscious all the while, only carping now and again in his stupor. I was about to put some water down his throat from my cupped hands when he started showing signs of coming to. This, for me, had become like a theatrical play, and I was the audience of one, being able to change the performance at will. So I decided to stay out of sight, see how he would react when he realised water was at hand. To gain pleasure from a man's misery would normally be against my grain, but this was truly an exceptional day for me. I watched intensely as the newcomer slowly came around. His mumbling ceased, and his hands started to feel the ground around him, although his eyes remained shut. The only audible sound now was the water gurgling down the trough. My impatience for things to transpire had become excruciating. Finally, he opened his eyes. He gazed around in wonderment. His face was a picture of sheer disbelief when he saw the water gully. Again, I found myself having to tolerate a short expanse of time as he continued to gape at the water, as if it weren't there. Then he was upon it like a frenzied animal. I could almost feel the man's pleasure as he slurped and quenched his craving, and I recognised the cry of pain that caused him to wail, as he obviously experienced tenderness from guzzling water down an exceptionally dry throat. He should have known better. I stayed put. I was curious as to what his next move might be. Once his thirst had been quenched, he just sat for a while looking around his environment. When he did decide to finally get off his arse, he wobbled and looked unsteady and decidedly weak. I chuckled to myself when I noticed he had pissed his breeches. After looking through the gaps of the greenery, he began to saunter upwards, so I followed, keeping well out of sight. On a couple of occasions I accidentally made some clumsy noises in the foliage, which caused him to stop for a moment, cock an ear, then carry on. Once he had reached the highest point of the gradient, he scrambled to the top of a small rocky mound and surveyed the land in panoramic fashion. And, as he did, I concluded that he would now probably realise that he was on an island. I kept my vigil. I felt a mixture of excitement and fascination. What on earth would be his strategy? Following his brief survey of the land, he started to make his way downwards, with me in unknown tow, a secret shadow. Within 20 minutes he had reached a promontory, and then carried on down to the rocks and sea, where he ambled about aimlessly before sitting on a rock and crying, and then thrashing his hands around in the water. It was at this moment I weakened slightly. I felt a pang of sympathy, an easing of rigidity, which led me to think that I should now show myself, although I would remain circumspect and stay on my guard. Before I could do so, he had thrust himself into the water and started swimming in the direction of the beach where he had been washed up. I almost felt pleased that the theatrics were to continue for at least a bit longer. Yet all the while I somewhat recriminated myself for behaviour that could be construed as callous or inhumane. Although a brief reminder to myself as to what type of man I might be dealing with eased these feelings of heartlessness. Keeping well out of sight, I skirted close to the edge of the sea, trailing the undesirable to where his raft was. He wearily dragged himself out of the water and collapsed next to the raft, and appeared to doze off. He must have been utterly fatigued, as any man might well be. Although I fancied he was a fairly strong-minded individual who wouldn't be quitting without a struggle. When the naval man came round, it was with a start, as if he'd been having a frightening or unpleasant dream. I elected not to show myself. I had other ideas. I watched as he gathered up canvas from the raft, then I followed him as he traipsed up into the shrubbery. The dark of night was now setting in, so I figured he would be looking to bed down somewhere. When he got up to the water gully, he immediately found one of my old pits that I had dug on the second day of being marooned on the island. Within 5 minutes I heard him snoring, so I felt it safe to peer over the side. There he lay, wrapped in his sails. Slumber for him had come quick, although due to all the drama that had transpired and that which was to carry on tomorrow, I had a restless night. I even got up and checked on the stranger a couple of times. It seemed he too was having an uneasy night.